You are listening to Salty Believer Unscripted, a conversation on Christian ministry and the Christian life. This is Salty Believer Unscripted. I'm Brian Catherman, and with me is
Josiah Walker.
All right, and we are back at these discussions of things that are going on that encompass ministry, that sometimes have to do with pastors, sometimes have to do with just the guy in church. And Josiah, I have a topic. I barely let you know what I want to talk about, so I'm going to put you in the hot seat here. But a documentary just came out at the time of this recording, and it's available on, I saw that it was out on YouTube, called The Real David Platt. I think it's in 2 parts. And you said you saw it.
I did, yeah. I watched both parts Saturday night. So
okay, so I mean, by the time this podcast kind of comes out, I mean, we're a little bit ahead of that, but it'll be out there a little bit. I'm sure different people, different responses, different things will probably have happened. But I want to talk about sort of how these things tend to go. So, I suppose before we start, what is this documentary? Can you kind of give us just an overview of what in the world this thing is?
Yeah, for sure. So, this is a documentary about McLean Bible Church in Virginia, and it looked like they had about 20, maybe 30 members who are upset, who have been members there for a long time. And the premise of the movie or the documentary is basically that David Platt hijacked their church and changed their church and kicked some of them out as members, and they're just upset, they're disgruntled, and they just feel like he changed everything.
So this is those individuals putting that documentary together. So before we get into kind of that whole thing, how would you say it compared to something like the Hillsong documentary, or maybe the rise and fall of Mars Hill, or one of these things where people are talking about problems? How would you say it kind of lines up against those kinds of documentaries?
Yeah, it was hard because it looked very believable, but it was all very one-sided. It was because it was all from the people who were upset or mad at the church. They said that they had reached out to David Platt and some of the other people in the church, but nobody there really responded for comments or to be interviewed. And so it's hard to say. I feel like the similar thing happened with the rise and fall of Mars Hill, where you didn't hear Driscoll's side or anything like that. And so it's hard to really balance that out and say, hey, can I believe all this? Because you're only hearing one side of the argument. Right.
And, hey, a bunch of people that are really angry at you, who are making a documentary about you being a horrible person. Hey, would you like to comment? Who wants to comment?
Right. And
they go, oh, well, we reached out and they didn't comment. I'm not saying this is the case for this particular documentary, but in any of these cases, sure. Obviously, right. I really didn't want to go down this rabbit trail with
I'd probably be hesitant to speak in a documentary like that, We've seen that happen with more popular documentaries, like the American Gospel movies. I know that there's one coming out that they've been working on, that they interviewed a guy, and then after seeing the clips and the way they wanted to show his interview, he said, no, you can't show any of that stuff. He was unhappy with it.
That is not how that was supposed to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So just to be really fair and transparent, you're basically saying you don't know how biased or unbiased this may or may not be. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So it all looked very believable, but the hard thing is when you're only hearing that one side, right? You can get caught up and go, oh my gosh, is this true? Did this actually happen this way?
What is all this? Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So let's talk through that. So the general premise was, this group of people made a documentary stating that David Platt did something with the church they didn't like. Is that what you're getting at? Let's just get that out on the table. What was it? Yeah, for
sure. I don't know who produced the documentary. I can't remember who the actual producers are, but they were interviewing 10 or 15 people who were upset and had actually sued the church over these changes. The church had gone from being congregational led to kind of a top-down hierarchy, and they just felt like that was against their constitution. They felt like they were being silenced in members' meetings, and so they just felt like things had changed and they had no participation in those changes. And so they were upset and actually ended up going to court over it. So,
and did they say how the court case ended? Did it end in their favor, against them, for them, still in proceedings?
Yes, no, both. But yeah, so they won some rulings, lost some rulings. Things are still working. It sounds like they made it sound like David Platt and the church is just spending an exorbitant amount of money to just continue keeping this in court rather than resolve it.
Which again, having not seen the documentary or know anything about the situation, again, we just need to be aware, use good discernment, that there may be a lot of truth in what these individuals are saying, and
Sure.
there may be a lot of truth in what David Platt is saying, and there may be a lot of falseness and maybe misunderstanding. I mean, there might be a lot of stuff here. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. Like, how do we, as church members, how do we think about these sorts of things when they roll out? Because it's so easy to make assumptions, right? Like, we, we talked about what happens when Steve Lawson has a stumble or Matt Chandler had a thing, and we're not in those rooms. We don't know the
Right.
details. And so you assume something, you don't assume something. Oh, the church is falling apart and it must be this or it must be that. And we really, in the big scheme of things, we don't really know. And so the problem with these big celebrity things, like David Platt, the Hillsong thing, I'm trying to think of some others. I think there was like um, I'm just trying to think of some of these other documentaries that have come out more recently about. I think there was one on Andy Stanley, but I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, there's a guy that does a making of a minister documentaries on Andy Stanley, Stephen Furtick, other guys like that.
Right,
Uh,
right, right, right.
so
um, so or podcasts. So
sure.
my aim here is to say, okay, how do we think about, or how should we think about these things? How should we approach them? So first of all, I'm going to ask you this question, Josiah. Uh, is it something that you think nobody should watch, everybody should watch? Where are you at on that spectrum?
I don't know. It kind of felt like a train wreck that I couldn't turn away from. So I watched it, but I left going, wow, was that really a good use of my 3 hours?
It's 3 hours long.
Yeah, the first one's like an hour, and the second one was like an hour and a half, hour and 40 minutes or something.
Okay.
So, because at the end of the day, I'm not at that church. I don't read David Platt's books. I don't listen to his sermons, and so it
Is
doesn't
that
affect
because
my life.
is that because of some preference, like, I think he's horrible, or just not the books you're reading right now?
Those just, yeah, they're not the books I'm reading right now. So I don't really know much about the guy.
Would you say this was it like in the zone of like gossipy? Did it feel like that?
It felt like I was getting a front row seat to a church's own personal drama and issues and conflict,
Oh no. Did
and
you
and, and that's kind of,
did you feel that when you, because you listened to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, didn't you?
I did, yeah.
Did you feel that way when you listened to that?
It wasn't as bad. I felt like the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill was a little more therapeutic, where they were just talking through some of hurts and some things that had happened, and were really shedding light. I felt like they did a little better job of kind of showing different sides, both internally in the church and externally, as far as like members and attenders of that church. Where
Right.
this was mostly just members. They had a couple guys that I think one had been an elder before, um, but I think they were talking more into to Mark Driscoll and who he was, and this just felt like David Platt had just come in and just done his own thing and made the church his and just kind of like hijacked it along with a couple other
Is
men.
is
So,
this stuff all still going on? Because like the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill felt like there was some distance between
and
the
that's probably why that
problem.
one wasn't so, jarring because it has been a long time since then. Obviously, there's still issues at this church. This lawsuit is still ongoing. David Platt is still a pastor there. I think what we'll really be telling is what happens since that documentary's come out. At the time of this recording, I think it's this weekend that it came out. So
Yeah,
if
it's been
David
like a
Platt
day.
resigns and leaves, then you'll know it was a big issue.
I mean,
So
yeah, I think it's been 1 or 2 days because it's Monday,
yeah,
and you said you saw it on Saturday. I think I saw that it
yeah,
came out this weekend. So,
right.
I mean, who knows? We'll see how that goes. Um, okay, so uh, as we think about these issues, have you have you gotten caught up in, as a church member? I mean, I know you're a pastor, and I'm sure this has happened to you as a pastor. We can talk about that separately. Have you ever felt like you kind of gotten caught up in these kinds of issues in a church? I mean, you don't have to get into the details, but I feel like I've been in my years past, like, oh, there's a church drama, and I've sort of taken a side and whatever. Have you ever been involved in one of those kinds of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that kind of stuff happens all the time. Ministry can be messy, and I've been involved in church conflicts before. I've been a disgruntled church member before, and it's helpful to realize there's multiple sides to every story, and there's
D
lots of different factors that play into things.
What do you think what do you think would have been benefited if in one of those situations you were in? And I'll answer too, but if there was like videos and it became really
Sure.
public, do you think it would have helped the situation or hurt the situation?
I think it probably would have hurt the situation. It's hard, obviously, because I look at a specific situation with a pastor in the past, and I think, man, if he had been a little more forthright to have some conversations and be a little more honest with people, they wouldn't be upset. I mean, it's years later and I'm having conversations with people who still don't really understand what had kind of unfolded. And so on the one hand, you would think, well, if there was a video out, then people would see that. But I think the opposite would be that everyone who supports that guy or doesn't know about those things or those issues would be like, hey, no, that's my guy. Come on, like you're in the wrong. And I think that happens even with like Stephen Lawson, where we don't know the details, but we go, hey, I like that guy. Come on, you guys are being too strict.
Right. Or we did. Let's say you don't like the guy, and you're like, "Yeah, I knew this would happen." Right? We just have
Right.
no information. So here's the part that I'm struggling with. Like, I don't. Okay, so David Platt is a celebrity that might feel like this is the only recourse because he's a public figure or something. But I
Sure.
don't know much about him. I don't know anything really about the church. I don't know. Like, so it feels like it's almost trying to stir people to an outcome. Whereas,
Right.
like with the rise and fall of Mars Hill or the documentary with Hillsong, I feel like a lot of that had come and gone. And now we're saying, what can we look at, good or bad, to learn from this, to understand it, opposed to influence the outcome?
Right.
I don't think there's any outcome to be influenced with the Mars Hill one. But,
Sure.
and I don't know about the Andy Stanley one, or those, the making of these
Yeah.
things, but
The only outcome there would be, maybe not continuing to read their literature or books or,
oh,
using some,
right.
you know,
That's pretty
uh,
fair.
you might not go to their church moving forward. But it does feel a little more disconnected, where Mars Hill was in Oregon, the Seattle, Washington area. Like if you live up there, that's not an issue anymore. If you don't,
Yeah, those churches are gone. Like, there's not even an option to engage in
right.
that stuff. I'm thinking about, and I don't know how you think about this, but I'm thinking about, as a pastor, I've had issues where people have been mad at me. It happens. Okay, a decision has to be made in the church. People are mad. You chose to get rid of something that the rest of the church isn't using anymore, but somebody was really tied to it. You make a decision that the majority of the people go, "Yep, this is good. It's good for the ministry," or whatever. I'm not saying I'm not even passing judgment on David Platt stuff. I'm just saying I've been in this
Sure.
place, right? And then two or three people are angry, and man, they're just angry. I mean, they just carry that out. They're rallying the troops. Pretty soon they start telling stories that you're like, that's not even really representing the truth very well. Suddenly the positions they held at one time have now been flipped, and now every single thing you've ever done has
Yeah.
been flipped, and it's awful and it's horrible, and and it's miserable. And eventually maybe people leave the church, maybe they don't, maybe you just keep working on them. It's so hard because as a pastor, you, I've taken the position like I don't need to I don't need to rally all the troops. I don't need to stir everybody up. That just makes the situation more difficult. So therefore, I'm going to try to be the calming force in some of these things. And yet, other people are firing it all up and making it all crazy. And then as I'm not saying anything, people go, "See, he's just not even concerned about it." Did you get a sense with this documentary that some of it could be that? Did you feel any of that? Did you? I mean,
Yeah, there was one couple there that I felt like were just trying to fire things up and exasperate the issue. They had received a letter saying they were no longer members in the church, and that if they wanted to talk about that, they could sit down with the elders and have a conversation about moving forward because they were, had been excommunicated, I guess, because of their just the way they were trying to shake things up. So then they went into the church, got badges, and went to a meeting that they weren't supposed to be at technically, and were videotaping the whole thing and making a scene and got issued trespassing
oh
warnings and
man.
had to go to court. And in their minds, they're advocating for like, hey, we need to deal with this issue. But I don't know that it was the healthiest way to handle that issue.
Yikes.
So,
Okay. Okay. That's really, really unfortunate. I mean, it sounds like the whole documentary is unfortunate, and it
sure.
sounds like it's a lot more of the same stuff we're dealing with in the world where everybody's upset at everybody and offended at everybody and taking their issues to social media. And, who knows if we're, you know, being very fair or not. What kind of, it's like, let's say you're just talking to somebody at your church or a friend, a Christian. What advice would you give them if they came to you and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about watching this movie or any movie like it"? Like, what advice would you give a Christian when it comes to these sorts of things that are now public and they're out there and they're, complicated?
I think my question would be, what is your motivation for watching this documentary? Is it because we want to watch something, we want the drama like we get with a lot of reality TV shows? Is it because you're trying to decide if you're going to read a new David Platt book and whether you can trust this guy or you're going to give money to that church? Because a lot of times I think if it's just to get kind of caught up in the drama and the conflict, I think that's a distraction from the enemy to keep us from doing things that are more edifying and glorifying to God.
Well, that's kind of what you had said too. Like, I think I wasted 3 hours on that.
For sure. Because at the end of the day, what we have to remember is every church goes through conflict. I've had people not like me in the past before, and sometimes it's about things that I have not even done. I heard one pastor talk about going to a new church and really stepping on some landmines just because he didn't know about the history of that church. So while
Yeah.
his intention was pure in making those decisions, he had kind of stepped on a real hot button issue and a wound on some people in that church. And so at the end of the day, we have to let the gospel reign supreme and really drive our conversations and our motivations.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that's really right. Um, so, okay, so you're saying, okay, watch with discernment if you're going to watch. I think that's a good word. What's the reason you want to watch this thing? Why are you getting tied up into it? What's going on? Um, that being said, how can somebody who is concerned about these things in their own church, okay, in your church or wherever, how
Sure.
can you be a good churchman, a good churchwoman, how can you be a good member at a church in these sorts of places? Did you pick up anything from watching this where you went, oh, that's not helpful? Or just what are your thoughts on that? How do
Yeah.
we serve well, right?
Sure. I told you the example of the couple that, ended up going in and videotaping everything and getting kicked out and trespassed. But there was another couple who said, hey, our friends are asking us questions because they've heard rumblings that there's misuse of finances in this church. So they kept being persistent of saying, hey, can we see the finances? Hey, can we please see this? And kept emailing and kept following up. And eventually we're allowed to come in. And the church, rightly so, was like, what is your motivation for this? Is this a hit job thing too? Or are you just genuinely curious? And they ended up, it sounded like having a good conversation. They left that conversation still feeling like, they might be hiding some things, but they did show us some stuff. And so I think there's a right way to handle things and a wrong way to handle things when you're faced with conflict in your church.
Do you think there's a time and a place in like this situation on this documentary with some of these folks, or situations, where it's like, you know what, this is probably not the place for me to attend as a church member anymore? In the conflict that you were involved in, were there people, and I don't know the situation, but were there people that were so hot that like maybe this isn't a good church for you?
Yeah.
Have you have you faced that before?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that happens. And I think sometimes God uses conflict like that to help cause us to move and change churches and go different places. You see in Acts 8:1 where the persecution that breaks out actually helps to advance the church.
And they,
So
yeah,
if you're frustrated because you're wanting to do ministry in an area where your church isn't feeling called to do ministry, or you're wanting to be involved in something that the pastor says, hey, now's not the right time, that might be a sign that, hey, maybe God has a different plan for this pastor from this church than he does for me and what he's calling me to do. And so it's having a healthy dialogue with that pastor and saying, hey, can we do this? And sometimes it's finding out, hey, the pastor wants to do that, but the timing's not right. And so you're all upset that he won't do it now. But if you'll just wait, that might be something that you can help participate in later. I think a lot of times we don't know the moving parts behind the scenes. We just see, what happens on Sunday mornings, and so we get a little disgruntled and upset, thinking that nothing's happening, right?
yeah.
So
I remember when we were just first starting to plant the church many years ago. We were planting. We just had no money, no anything. We were just getting started. We hadn't even launched. We were just kind of in a I don't want to call it practice. It was certainly worship services, but it wasn't
sure.
really public to the people. So our team is trying to figure out how to do things, and we had decided we're going to take the Lord's Supper together every week. That's just something we felt compelled to do, and again, we didn't have a lot of money, so this stuff, you have little cups, and you have the juice, and you have in some churches it's wine, which we weren't too poor for that, even if we wanted to do that. Little bread crackers, right? And we have no history. We don't even know what we're doing. And so the guys that were faithfully preparing this, and they were going to pass it, is going to help through this. They said, well, we don't know how many cups to prepare every week. So
Sure.
what if we have a little chart in this closet where we store our communion stuff, and on the chart just write how many cups did you fill, how many cups were left over, right? So
Sure.
it gives us an idea of how many people took the Lord's Supper. We didn't
Yeah.
know who, we didn't know what. We knew our group was small. It wasn't that big a deal. It did not seem like a big deal to me at all because they just wanted to get a little history because it wasn't the same people every week that
Right.
were collecting, and it wasn't the same people who were necessarily always setting up versus who were cleaning up. So like, hey, if you clean up, just write the number. If you,
Yeah.
well, I had somebody just hot as can be that we would count how many cups were left over when that is, this is the Lord's Supper and it's an issue between God and those people. And how dare we know how many people in our church were taking the Lord's Supper versus how many weren't. And I mean, he was hot. He was so mad. And I remember trying to work through it and finally had to say, brother, if this is the conviction that you're under, that we're trying to be good stewards and not waste too many communion cups. That's really our goal. We don't want to, we don't have any idea how many are we throwing out away. What do we do? Then maybe this church isn't going to be the best place for you because we're probably going to think like this in some other areas. And his issue, I remember, it was hard. He wanted to fight with me about, no, I just want you to change it my way.
Right.
This is my church. This is where I'm comfortable. This is how I want you to change it. And you're being super controlling. I'm like, what? I offered to him, would you like to be the one to prepare the cups, and clean up the cups and make sure we're doing this? Or would you like to give extra money that we have enough just to fill the whole thing and throw a bunch of cups away? Like what?
Right.
How do you want to do that? And it was, nope, I want you to do it my way.
Right.
And actually I said, well, what is your way? How would you propose we do this? And he had no answer. So I kind of came to the conclusion that he was just mad about that, but not part of the solution, right? Like,
Right.
what do you propose we do? I think a lot of times when we're in church, we can fall into that trap a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, what if I actually, it's easy to sit on the sidelines and say, hey, you did that wrong. What if I actually had to say what needed to be done that was right? And what if people disagreed with me?
Sure.
How would I handle that? What would I do? How would I deal with it? If half the church was upset, and am I willing to really get into the throes of this whole thing, or do I just want it my way? And I kind of think that's where a lot of these things come out and get really sideways. I mean, like, I suspect that's probably a huge part of what got sideways at McLean. Maybe that's part of it. I don't know. But it seems like our sinful nature of wanting it our way tends to come out on the surface. And pastors can do the same. I'm not saying that, I'm not letting David Platt off the hook if he was in the same boat. Hey, this is going to be, every one of these things is going to be the way I want it, and that's that.
Yeah.
I don't know. That can be equally as problematic. I'm just saying in these situations, I think we need to be aware that sometimes there's a lot more going on in Christ Church than we think. So I don't know. I don't know if that's helpful for people. At the end of the day, if you had to give the documentary, like, okay, let me just ask you these questions. Forget what we're talking about with the potential for gossip and sinful issues, or if David Platt if they're trying to expose a real problem. Let's just talk about the nuts and bolts of a documentary. Okay. Was it well made? Because it looks like it's just this sort of YouTube thing. It was well made.
It's a YouTube thing, but it was produced. It was a high value production. It was good.
They did a good job with it.
Yeah.
Is it? I saw that it's been distributed like in a bunch of places. So is it just out there for free?
I watched it for free just on YouTube. So I'm not sure. I think I watched it from the source that created it, but it did look, because it's getting shared on Facebook and social media and things like that. So it's out there for sure.
And you said it was like almost 2.5, 3 hours long. Is the content and the material worth a documentary that long? Did they do a good job with the editing is what I'm asking. Did they tell the most concise story, or did they give you a little too much? I'm kind of getting bored with this.
No, I didn't feel like it was too dry in the middle or anything like that. I thought it was pretty good. They covered quite a history, because it all kind of started in 2016, I think, 2014, 16, and finished up in like 2022 or something like that. So they covered a vast span of time. So okay,
so it's not just out there as a sort of a hodgepodge.
I've watched those documentaries where it's just what is happening. So.
When you're like, what is? Yeah, this could have been cut. This could have been done differently. Not too long, not too short, whatever. Okay, well, so if people decide they want to go watch it, where your encouragement is to use discernment, recognize there's probably a lot more sides to this. Let everybody have their chance to speak. be slow to make a decision if you're sitting from the sidelines, right? You're not even involved in it. And actually, you don't even have to make a decision. If you're not at the church and you're not involved, like, okay, that's something I should just pray about, that they can come to a really good place and there can be reconciliation between all these people, and away we go, right?
If anything, I hope it would just lead you to pray for your pastor and your congregation, that conflict would never get to that point where you're suing each other or suing the church. I read a story of a church where there was a potluck, and the man got mad because a kid at the potluck had a bigger slice of ham than he did. And the church ended up splitting and suing each other, and it was in the newspaper. And man, that just really hurt their gospel witness. So let's pray for our pastors, pray for our churches, that we can resolve our conflict and let the gospel reign.
Amen. That's a really good word. Hey, if you're listening, we appreciate that you're listening. We want to encourage, if you're not subscribed, get subscribed. If this is a helpful conversation, you just get to be a fly on the wall between pastors chatting about stuff, share with your friends. And we just appreciate those listeners who've been here for the long haul, those who are just dropping in, and we hope this has been helpful and edifying. Until next time. Thanks for listening. Salty Believer Unscripted is a production of SaltyBeliever.com. Visit the website to find more resources like the podcast you've just listened to.